And welcome to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the whole front line. So starting out here in the south of the front line, we see the Russian forces attacking in the Dacha area here to the south of Uledar. So after continuous attempts at assaulting Uledar itself, as well as the northern coal mine, they are now focusing on recapturing the Dacha area that the Ukrainians captured back on the 20th of February. So they're currently working on recapturing this part, as well as possibly the parts here to the west, and they will continue fighting in this direction, as it seems so far. Then we move on to the Marinka area, where here the Russian forces also continue attacking here in the center of the city. However, there aren't a lot of news on this area, so let's move on to the Donetsk front, where here the Russian forces are attacking in Pervomaiske, as they continuously do for the past few months. And then to the north of Vodiane and south of Severne, the Russian forces are being attacked by the Ukrainian forces trying to counterattack and recapture these fortified positions north of Vodiane. However, it seems that so far, on initial reports, the Ukrainians failed to recapture any territory. As for the south of Avdiivka and to the north, there is significant fighting, as especially to the north, the Russian forces are attempting to capture Kamyanka, as well as advance here southwest of Krasnoarivka. And according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the Russian forces are attacking both Stepove as well as Berzhishi, here to the west of Krasnoarivka, trying to cut off the rail lines that go in and out of Avdiivka, as well as reach these villages to the northwest of the city. Then we move on to the Bakhmut front, where the Ukrainian forces have managed to successfully recapture parts of the territory west of Ivanivske. Here we see the Ukrainian forces managed to capture this forest patch here to the west and this hill area here to the southwest of the current Russian positions on the front line. This allows them to cut off a crossing of the canal here to the west, as well as diminish the Russian presence west of the canal. However, they are still holding on to positions here across the canal, and the Russian forces are in turn attacking in the direction of Ivanivske. Then to the south of the city, there's no territorial changes. However, fighting continues in this part, both in the southwestern district as well as in the southern district. As for the northern part here, there is territorial changes, as the Russian forces have managed to capture this eastern part of the northeastern outskirts, east of the Azov plant, as well as advanced within the western part, where they're now close to the government office here to the northwest of Bakhmut, as well as advancing within the rail lines, which could add to the theory of Russian forces trying to cut off the city in two by the rail lines, which would explain the advance both to the south and to the north of the city. So what they are trying to do is that they would advance southwards and northwards from these two positions, which would make the Ukrainians believe that they're about to close off, which would allow them to get the idea of falling back across the rail lines. And at the same time, we see Russian advances to the southeast and the northeast of the city, which would motivate them to fall back across the rail lines. So this would essentially push the Ukrainians out of eastern Bakhmut, which would allow them to capture this central part and then focus on the western part by cutting off the roads and encircling them. Then we move to the west of Bakhmut, where fighting continues in the direction of Homove. Here in this area, the Russian forces are constantly shelling this village and settlement, and then they are now storming it from the north. As for the Avdiivka area, there's a lot of reports of heavy shelling here as well, and then successful attacks in this direction. However, there doesn't seem to be much of any territorial changes, as it seems that there's a lot of fighting going back and forth. According to a pro-Ukrainian source, some of these areas we see change hands twice a day, which means that there's a lot of back and forth in these areas. Then to the northwest of Avdiivka, the Russian forces are advancing here in this sector as well, after continuously advancing within these areas the past couple of days, if not weeks. Then the Russian forces are now advancing further in the direction of Ryhorivka, as well as this forest line to the north of the village. And fighting continues in the direction of Ryhorivka as well. Something important to notice about this part of the front line is that the Russians are expecting a large counteroffensive by the Ukrainians here in Bakhmut before the Russians manage to capture Bakhmut. So what they're doing to prepare for this is that they want to take control over the canal, because that would allow the Russian forces to have a good initial defensive position against the Ukrainian forces. So how exactly, or what exactly is the factors that determine whether or not they have control over the canal? There are a couple of villages that are significant for this. The first one is Avdiivka, of course. It is the most important one. Taking control over that or cutting it off will allow the Russian forces to have the canal line just ahead of Chesev, which is the most significant part to have control of. Then we also see Russian forces having to take control over Bohdyanivka, Kalinina, Ryhorivka, Khomove, and this small settlement east of Chesev. If they manage to capture these villages here to the south, they will have a significant advantage when facing the Ukrainian forces attempting to take control over Bakhmut after a constant Russian offensive for months. The Ukrainian forces are looking to break out that offensive. And then the final one is the villages of Privilya, Holubivka, Inkivka, and Orohovo, as this will extend the Russian control over the canal, as well as have a proper defensive line by the highway between Slovyansk and Bakhmut, which will allow the Russian forces to have a proper defense here to the north as well. So something very interesting is the fact that the western direction you constantly have to fight uphill, while in the eastern direction you constantly have to fight downhill. So the Ukrainians would have a significant advantage in this scenario, as the Russian forces would have a less defensible position than the Ukrainians had, on top of the fact that the Russian strategy of advance is that they want to destroy everything before advancing, so it will be difficult for them to set up any defensive positions other than natural barriers. So with no hills and no defensible positions, the only defensible position would be the canal, otherwise they would have to retreat constantly. Especially in the southern part, because here the only settlement is Klishivka. Other than that, they would have to retreat all the way to the highway south of Bakhmut, which would be a significant decrease if their achievements here to the south. And at the same time, the Russian forces would be looking at a situation where a lot of supply routes in and out of Bakhmut would reopen completely. While at the northern part, there's a lot of valleys, which will allow the Russian forces to set up defensive positions, as well as their control of Selesnyansk. This will allow the Russian forces to actually set up defenses here in the north, contrary to the south, where it is open fields, which would make it difficult for the Russians to defend this area. So most likely, if we see a Ukrainian counteroffensive, they will attack in the direction of the front line here to the north, just to hold the line, while in the south their real punch will go through, as they will attempt to push the Russians back to the highway or even further beyond. While in the northern area, if they tried to push here, the Russians would most likely hold them off after an initial push. Then for the Siversk area, we see the Russian forces are attacking on the whole front line essentially, as they are attacking the direction of Vasyukivka, Fedorivka, Rostolivka, Vesele, Spirne, Verkhnokamianske, and Bilohorivka. So on this whole front line, the Russian forces are attempting to break through the Ukrainian positions and essentially give themselves a better position where they can take advantage of to cut off Siversk from the Bakhmut area, as well as threaten the Ukrainian positions here. Then for the Kreminna front, the Russian forces are attacking the direction of the Serebryansky forest area, here south of Kreminna, as well as in the direction of Avdiivka, Terny, and Makivka, where here the Russian forces are attempting to gain a better position across the river line, allowing them to hold a better defensive position and stage a offensive towards Liman. And then finally, the Russian forces are also attacking in the direction of Novoselivsk. As we can also see, there's a river line here to the west, which would allow the Russian forces to have a better defensive position here to the north as well. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.